In a world where hustle culture collides with wellness warnings and workplace demands keep evolving, how do we stay sharp without burning out? How do we navigate the endless stream of wellness trends while actually getting results? This is the Work and Wellness Podcast, and I'm your host, Ange Davis. Drawing from my own journey of wins, stumbles, and honest revelations, I'll be bringing you raw, unfiltered conversations with experts and inspiring guests who've been there, lived it, and found a better way. Together, we'll cut through the noise and workshop what it really means to be well in today's workplace. No more choosing between success and sanity. No more sacrificing health for achievement. Whether you're struggling with burnout, searching for purpose, or simply ready to work smarter, not harder, you're in the right place. This is real talk about real solutions for real people. Let's get into it. Hello, friends. Welcome to the show. Today's guest is Dr. Lisa Riegel. Lisa is a leadership and wellbeing consultant and the creator of Neurowell framework, a neuroscience-based approach designed to help educators and leaders improve performance, resilience, and engagement without adding to burnout or workload, which I think is so important. Her work sits at the intersection of brain science, psychology, and practical leadership strategy, translating complex neuroscience into tools that leaders can actually use in high-pressure environments. Today, we're going to explore what neuroscience can teach us about leadership, why so many high performers are operating in constant stress response, which I'm sure many of us can relate to, and how small shifts in the way we design environments, expectations, and culture can dramatically improve both well-being and performance. Welcome to the show, Lisa.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Great to be here. I'm excited to chat about neuroscience because I do think sometimes it can sound a little overwhelming and maybe a little too sciencey, but actually there's some really practical things that we can do. But I want to just start by talking about your career path. You've had a really fascinating path across education, leadership, neuroscience. What first sparked your interest in wanting to understand the brain better and how it influences our performance and our behavior?
Sure. So when I went to do my doctoral work at Ohio State, I was interested in leadership, but I was really interested in the human system instead of the policy and org theory type stuff. So that started my interest in the idea that real change starts in the brain and it starts with engaging people. So we can make policies to shape change, but if we don't understand how to engage and motivate people, then those policies fall flat. So I went down that road. I did a lot of work with special education for a while. When I was doing that work, I started really getting more into the science of executive functioning. And I started realizing that really behavior is the intersection of biology and context. And so if we understand the biology, we reframe problems that we see in students or staff. And then we can align solutions that will work. And then ultimately we control our context. So if we create a context that is focused on wellness and fulfillment, then the whole system operates more efficiently.
I think that's so interesting. Immediately, I thought of sort of nature versus nurture there in terms of biology and context. Is that sort of the approach that you're speaking about there, sort of where there is a portion of us that is biologically a certain way, but that we actually have self-efficacy in many ways by changing our context?
Yes, that, and also our context changes our biology. And so that nature nurture is really that debate of which one is it. The answer is and in both.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the epigenetic side of things, isn't it? That our context is shifting our biology, which is pretty cool. I think, we can think of neuroscience as being quite academic or quite scientific. What really made you want to translate that into more practical frameworks? Because it can really sit in that very academic side of things. So what made you sort of want to translate that?
So I've always been an action-oriented human. So, I think that theories are great, but if we don't teach people what they look like in practice, then they just remain theory. So as I was looking at neuroscience, my goal is really that people can be self-aware, self-regulated, and in self-control. And in order to do that, we have to understand how our brain works. And we're just not taught that. And so we don't have to be neuroscientists, but I think a basic understanding of how perceptions are formed and how our stress regulation system works, and also how the mind and body are really part of the same system. You think about if you go to a doctor for a mental concern, you go to a psychiatrist. If you go for a neurologic concern, you go to a neurologist. If you go because you have stomach aches, you go to a gastroenterologist. So we treat our body as if it's piecemeal. But the reality is one affects the other and the other affects back to the body. So that mind-body connection is really important to being well and being fulfilled and being happy.
I think we've got a long way to go in the way that we integrate when we go, to see medical professionals for sure. But I love what you said a minute ago about self-aware, self-regulated self-control. How do we become more self-aware, Lisa? Because I think particularly in a world of distraction, this is my perspective anyway, perhaps we're becoming less and less self-aware as a society because I don't know, maybe we are sort of handing over our agency to external factors. Do you have any tips on how we can become more self-aware?
So I think the first thing is to understand how your brain perceives the reality around you. So our brain, 80% of the traffic in our brain is unconscious. It's below our nose. So we're doing a lot of thinking and processing that the part of us that makes us who we are is not really weighing in. And so understanding that perceptions are formed in our thalamus, which is in that limbic system. And basically its job is kind of like a data manager. So it takes in all the information from the environment. And its first job then is to make sensory associations. Like this is like that. And if every new experience in our life was brand new, our brain would explode. So it looks for patterns. So the data manager of our brain goes into this sensory memory center and it says, okay, this is like that. And then our brain and body respond the exact same way as they did because the limbic system doesn't know time and can't tell a story. So it will respond the exact same way that it did whenever those filters were created for our brain. So in a practical sense, I work with people and I say, let's make a list of your stressors. And, I personally, time is a stressor for me. I always want to be on time. I know where the association between anxiety and time comes from because when I was a kid, my parents were divorced and my dad was always late. So I sat on the front stoop all the time and my little 8-year-old brain connected time with worth or love or, respect. And so my body, when even in my 20s and 30s, when cognitively I was way past that and I knew that what was happening right now had nothing to do with when I was 8 years old, I didn't get to weigh in on that because that limbic system did all the thinking. And so I would find like if my husband was late, I would be angry and I would be anxious about it. And sometimes it would ruin my evening. So by understanding the fear below the trigger that makes you angry, and sometimes it's I don't fit in or I'm not smart enough or people don't respect me or whatever that underlying fear is, by understanding what that is, then we equip the thinking part of our brain to send message down. So like my brain said, hey, data manager, uncouple this. This is a faulty sensory association. And I need to weigh in on each individual situation. And so that self-awareness starts by some introspection and examining what are the underlying fears that our brain is trying to protect us from.
I love that. How do you suggest people do introspection? Because sometimes you can kind of sit there and think, what I'm supposed to be thinking about. Do you have any techniques or ways that people can do a little bit of introspection or notice when they might be reacting in a certain way?
Yeah, so there's two things. One is what I was just talking about. Make a list of your stressors and then look for that underlying fear. The other is to understand how your body experiences stress. So I do something called name it, own it, control it. And it's what are the stages of stress? So the first is what does your body feel like when you start to get stressed? Second question is what does your body look like? And I actually did this with a group of teachers once. And the one teacher's like, well, I don't really know what I look like when I'm stressed. And her teaching partner was like, I do. She's like, your eyebrows disappear up into your bangs. And so, that gives some visual cues. And then the third is what is your brain telling you? And it's not what are you thinking because you're not thinking. All this thinking is going on before you get to weigh in. And if your stress system gets into overdrive, then there's two things that happen. If your brain thinks that there's a stressful or fearful situation, then your amygdala, which is like your security monitor, it either taps a panic button, which immediately sends a message to the thinking part of your brain that says, hey, we're not sure how to respond. We need you to weigh in. or wails on that panic button, and the message that goes up says, we don't need you, go get a cup of coffee, you're in danger, we will save you, the limbic system. So there's a whole lot of people that are running around and their actions are being dictated through this limbic system that is not the thinking part of their brain. And so understanding how your body experiences stress, you can stop that stress from escalating before it gets to a point where the thinking part of your brain is disconnected.
Oh my God, that's so interesting, because many of us are certainly, we must be walking around not even realizing we're responding in ways that we are. How do you think a leader could take this information, which is really helpful, and interpret the behavior within their teams to better lead their teams?
Yeah, so I actually my newest book just came out. It's called Aspirations to Operations, and it's a leader's guide to helping to make transformation stick. And what I talk about in there is an 8C framework. And the first part is culture, building a culture where people feel like they belong. So like if you ever go into a meeting and you look around and you're like, these are not my people, then you crawl inside yourself and you disengage, right? Where if you walk in and you're like, these are my people, then you're ready to take risks and open up. Part of it is really, how do we create a culture that is not just words on a wall, but is truly backed up by routinized actions, that this is how we do business here. And then there's 3 planning C's. So it's clarity, coherence, and cadence. So thinking, do people actually know what you want of them? And I think that a lot of leaders are very aspirational, but they don't go down from that 30,000-foot view to the 10-foot view. And so people never really feel comfortable that they're achieving what they're supposed to do because they don't know what it is.
Yeah.
And then there's that coherence piece of like, is, this new initiative that you want to do or this new change you want to see, is it competing with something else where somebody's going to be in a lose-lose situation? And then thinking of the cadence, there's a lot of, again, the brain is built to work on fear, to keep us alive. And fear is a good way for us to stay safe. So anytime there's changes, you're going to have different kinds of people that are going to resist change for different reasons. So by understanding the science behind that resistance, you can become more proactive about paving the way where people will be comfortable. And then there's, once you get that planning and that culture built, then you have engagement C's, which are the coaching and collaboration. And so I have, how leaders can set up meetings more effectively and make sure collaboration is useful and productive. And then how you coach, leaders spend a ton of time in conflict resolution, but if they understand that it's not the conflict of right now, I mean, the way our brain creates those perceptions, how we are reacting right now has something to do with how our brain is associating what it's feeling and seeing to our past. And so conflict, it's actually everything to do with how our brain has organized our past. So understanding that changes the way that you address conflict, the way you coach people. And then the celebration and communication are the sustainability C's. And I think that's another area that leaders do not do well in a lot of settings. They don't authentically celebrate people. They do like, we're doing an employee lunch and everybody gets a sandwich or something like that, but truly celebrating people's efforts and tying it back to the clarity of purpose and the unity of the culture within the organization makes a big difference.
What a great framework and blueprint for leaders to follow too, because what I see a lot, Lisa, is people are promoted into leadership roles often because they're great at their individual contributor role, but they're not necessarily given the tools or the blueprint to be able to lead effectively, and they kind of just test and learn along the way, see what works, see what doesn't. And so I think it's awesome to have a framework like that can really help. You mentioned collaboration as one of those C's, and what I have seen a lot is when leaders are dysregulated, often decision-making and collaboration sort of go out the window because they're just focused on what they need to get out and can't sort of look up. What role do you think emotional regulation plays in performance, both for individuals and for leaders? And how does a leader's emotional regulation impact a team?
I love that you asked that because it is everything. If you have a dysregulated leader, you are not going to have regulated staff. So the more that leaders can become more self-aware, self-regulating, and in self-control, the more strategic they can be about being the leader that their people need. And, it's funny, I used to teach leadership courses at Ohio State, and they always want people to write their leadership platform. And I'm always like, that's the dumbest assignment. Because what is a lead? What platform is one sentence? I lead in a way that others follow. That's it. Your
Yeah.
job as a leader is to get people to follow you. And so it doesn't really matter what your preferences are. It matters what your team needs. And if your team is needing a calming environment or needing more support, a good leader will give that to the team so that they can excel.
Yeah, absolutely. How do you think, in practical terms, leaders can regulate themselves when there is chaos around them, right? And I think I particularly want to target this, I suppose, at the middle management level, because my personal view is that's actually the most difficult level of leadership,
Yes.
because you've got so much pressure coming down. You've got to distill that and try and not push that pressure down to your team. But then you've got expectations from your team on how to lead. How can particularly that middle management or middle level of leadership, regulate themselves when they've got dysregulation coming down at them and up?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is time management and setting aside time, because oftentimes those middle manager people are the ones that are interrupted all day long with just the day-to-day stuff. So, scheduling out and posting your schedule outside your office door or having a shared calendar where you have blocked off time where you need to solve problems or do deep thinking so that you're not interrupted. Because I think that constant interruption then dysregulates us because we're like, I'm overwhelmed. I'm never going to get this stuff done. So time management is the first one. The second one is a self-care routine. So setting a timer on your phone every half hour, it goes off, and you do a couple neck stretches, a couple deep breaths, maybe a vagus nerve exercise, and then you go back to work. It takes 1 minute. It's like a 1 minute breather, but it gives your body a chance to relax. And if you do that over time, then your body learns to relax every 30 minutes. You don't need a timer anymore. And so it just kind of keeps everything going. And then the third thing I would say goes back to that celebration. Celebration produces dopamine, which makes us feel good and gives us a little hit of energy. So making sure that you're looking for the good things that happen in the day instead of admiring all the problems. And, there was an interesting video. Researchers had people count how many baskets somebody did when they were throwing a basketball. And then they would say, okay, they'd turn it off and they'd say how many baskets, and the people would report how many they counted. And they would say, did you see the giant gorilla walk across the basketball court? And so many people didn't see it because their data manager in their brain was programmed to look for one thing. So if we program ourselves to look for the good things that are happening around us, we will notice those things. And it reduces our stress.
It's so interesting you say that. Do you know Dr. Daniel Amen? He's quite a famous psychiatrist. Yeah. So he actually says, and it sounds quite cheesy to say it, but when you wake up and you say today is going to be a great day, you're doing the same thing. You prime your brain to be focused and look at the good stuff throughout the day. So I think that the example you gave is a really practical example of what our brain does so that it doesn't become overwhelmed, I'm sure. I want to talk a little bit about psychological safety, because we do hear a lot about psychological safety now. In Australia, we have recently legislated psychosocial safety. So organisations are responsible and accountable for psychological safety of employees now. But I think it's often misunderstood. And so I'd love, from your perspective and a neuroscience perspective, to know why psychological safety is actually so important for engagement and performance.
Yeah, so our brain needs to feel safe. And so psychological safety can be emotional safety. It can also be intellectual safety. So I'll give you an example. AI is everywhere right now, and we've got a lot of stress in the workforce. And when you think about, if you've done your job a certain way and you're really good at your job, so you're a resident expert and it's part of your identity and how you view yourself as an employee. And all of a sudden we come in and we start to automate the process that you are really good at. It's not psychologically safe for you, because now all of a sudden you're like, I'm a novice. I'm losing status. I'm losing, prestige within my peers. So as we start to try to make changes in the way people do their work, I think it's really important to make sure that we're helping them see how they are still valued, or how they still retain some of that expertise or sense of self. And then, the other piece is that emotional safety. I was at the hospital, I had to have some tests run, and the doctor had come in and he said, he's like, we're going to get started in a minute. He goes, but can you just give me a minute? We have a real quick thing we do every day. And I said, sure. And he went in the hall and the nurse went in the hall and I could hear what they were doing. And they were out there and they stood in a circle. It was all the members of the team that were working that area in that shift. And they went around and said one thing that they really appreciated that team member did for them, either the shift before or had already done that shift today. And it was specific, concrete things, not just you're nice to me and you always help me out, but like a actual thing. And they celebrate. And when they came back in, they were smiling, both of them. And I said, do you do that every day? And they said, we do it every day. And he said, it just takes all that stress and lowers it down. And it reinforces the idea that we are a team and we're all here to help each other. And so that's, a practice that can be really powerful. And again, it takes 5 minutes.
That's a fantastic practice. And it actually can be done in any team, right? It doesn't, doesn't have to be in a hospital situation. I think that's fantastic. And also it makes people feel more purposeful in what they're doing. Like they're making a difference, they're being appreciated and not feeling like they're just sort of on that hamster wheel, which I think is really important.
Yes, absolutely.
I think a lot of organizations are trying to improve culture. If I think about my time in corporate organizations, there's always a lot of focus on culture and employee engagement. But what I often see is that the responses to culture are layering more and more things on top of people who are already stretched. So you gave a good example of that sort of circle stand-up, but what are some other ways or changes that leaders can make that actually shift culture that don't feel like just another sort of activity that employees have to do?
Right. So I think there's two things. One is that culture is what we do, not what we say. So thinking of taking your corporate values or what you want the culture to be, and then actually creating statements of what does this look like in practice? So if we say we are kind to others, what are examples of that happening? And then each time you have team meetings, having some shout outs and celebrations that are tied directly to those kinds of actions. Like, what did your team member do to show that you were kind? Kind of like the hospital where they were focused on teaming and appreciating, but being very selective about what we're calling out for people. So again, we notice when people do those things because it's always present and we've primed our brain for it, but it's also reinforcing that. The second thing is that culture is built on relationships. So giving people opportunities to get to know each other in a different context than just work. So for example, we created we called it Punch It Up. And there was a card and it had all different kinds of activities people could do. So like there was a woman who was a yoga instructor and she said, I'll stay after on Wednesdays and do a yoga session for anybody who wants to come. So if you attended, you got a punch. The manager had morning happy hours and he would bring in donuts and croissants and things and coffee. And the rule was you couldn't talk about work. You had to talk about your family, your dog, your, hobbies, whatever. And so if you attended, you got a punch. And so we created like 10 or 12 different things that people could do that would just authentically connect them around something they were interested in. We started a healthy lunch club. So if there's 10 people, that means I only have to bring lunch every 10 days. And you would bring, a crock pot that would feed 10 people and your recipe. And so then it gave people, I could be like, Angela, that was the best soup. I just love that soup. And it gives you a chance to say, oh, my mother made it, or, and it's a way to make those personal connections. And I think we get so tunnel visioned about what we have to get done and so stressed about now. We forget to take times to let people connect.
Yeah, I agree with you so much on that. It becomes very transactional when we feel like we're busy, doesn't it? Yes. And I think particularly if people are working remotely, you even lose that another step. You don't have that moment where you're walking to the lift together or where you might walk into the kitchen together where you're just chatting. You just connect online and you're immediately into business. And so I think that can have a real impact on people not having that ability to connect, like you said. What impact do our relationships or that connection have on our brain and our performance?
So I think, again, it's really about that belonging. Like if I walk in and I feel a sense of belonging and I feel like these are my people and they're here to support me, then I'm open and my brain does not go into a stress mode. The associations that my brain makes is these people are safe. And so when I'm with them, my body's relaxed. This is really important because if your body goes into stress, if you're really stressed out, you can't access your executive functions. are planning and organizing, prioritizing, impulse control, emotional regulation. So if you've ever been really mad or really anxious and stressed, and then when you calm down, you're like, why did I even do that? Like, why did I say that? I don't even believe that, right? It's because you were not able to access the part of you that makes you you. And so productivity and engagement and efficiencies go through the roof when we can use this part of our brain. If you have employees that are running around in a stress-infused environment, then they're not thinking, and you're going to end up with mistakes. You're going to end up with misunderstandings and impulsive action, disastrous experimentation, a lot of conflict.
Which is risky to business, I think. But how do we stop glamorizing busyness? Because I think we still have a way to go. You know, like I reflect back to my time in corporate, and you would get into a lift and say, how are you? Busy, so much on. And imagine if you got into a lift and you said, I'm feeling really regulated today. Like, I just wonder how that would be perceived. Like, oh, do you need some more work? You know? So how do we sort of challenge that idea that busy is success?
Right. And I think that's kind of where it goes back to clarity in my 8C framework, is that if I'm clear about what I'm supposed to do, you know, and when you think about trying to do a new innovation, it's really a theory of change. It's these different, you know, outcomes are going to change if we do this. And so if we understand that, then I can get in my car at the end of the day and say, I did all the things I need to do today and I did my job. But when we don't have that clarity around what we're supposed to be doing, then we always feel like we're missing something. And it becomes where the busiest person is the most honored or productive instead of the most efficient person. So if you want to value efficiency and productivity, then that clarity makes a big difference. And then if we're doing all the things that we said we were going to do and our metrics aren't moving, then our theory of change is wrong, not our employee. And so trying to make sure you're measuring both your outcome measures, but also what I call your output measures. So, you know, it's we think if our staff does X, Y, and Z, that we're going to move these measures that we want to move, but you got to measure, did we do X, Y, and Z? And so that you can then test that theory.
Yes, I think that's so important, because often it goes to, it's the employee's fault. They're not doing enough. They're not smart enough. They don't care. You know, they're not performing enough. And I really like what you said, that it should be efficiency over, you know, being busy. My perspective when I was a leader was, I want you out of here before, you know, 5:30, right? Like, if you're doing your job really effectively, you should be able to get out. And if you can't, either there's a problem with clarity or how you're doing your work, or we've misjudged your workload and there's actually too much work for a single person. So, I think it's an important distinction to make, and really shifting that's really important. What impact do you think AI is having on people's ability to regulate, but also on our brains? Because I think one of the things that I'm concerned about is there's a lot of research starting to emerge that maybe it's making us less smart, and we're sort of handing over our decision making to AI, and we're not using our judgment and our discernment. So what are your thoughts on the way that AI is impacting our brains and also our nervous system regulation?
Yeah, I have big concerns about it. And our brain learns through repetition, experience, and emotion, thousands of times of doing things. And so, you know, even as a kid, I memorized phone numbers. And you don't have to do that anymore, which is great, except you're not working your working memory. So we're not developing that. You know, I used to go to the library and go through a card catalog and then go through a spatial and then skim and, you know, pre-read and all that. We don't have to do that anymore. And as AI comes, it just takes that level of what technology, they call it cognitive offloading. It's taking that cognitive offloading exponentially more. And so now we're not having to be critical thinkers or problem solvers or even information organizers. It'll organize everything for you. So I think the thing that scares me is that this part of our brain, this part that I've been talking about in your limbic system, that's just an animal brain that's designed to keep your heart beating and keep you alive and keep you out of danger. This is the part of the brain that makes us human beings. And this is the part that makes you uniquely who you are. If we continue to outsource its functioning to technology, what happens to even us as humanity? And then part of the executive functions is also impulse control and emotional regulation. So it's all those kind of planning and organizing and thinking skills, but it's also these other pieces. And so even if you look now, I mean, people are outraged if you get on social media and you go down, or even if you read, I mean, you can read an article about somebody saving a puppy and 5 comments down, they're like yelling at each other, you know? So we're already seeing this deterioration of our ability to communicate and to control ourselves. And I fear that it will only get worse unless we start being very intentional about providing spaces for thinking and for that self-awareness and self-regulation.
I think it's such an important point you raised, because as you were speaking, I started thinking about how much more I'm even seeing road rage when I'm driving, and how people's ability just to accept that, you know, like, okay, maybe I did something wrong, sorry, or I'm just going to put my blinker on and come in. And people are just, that self-control and that ability to just sort of regulate in the moment seems to be getting less and less. And I think there is a good case for AI in some circumstances. You know, it takes some of these menial tasks off, you know, workloads and roles. But yes, I am worried about our brains and how we're continuing to develop even things like just adding numbers and doing long division, or, you know, things like that are actually so important for our brain, but it's very easy just to default to AI or, you know, calculators and things like that.
Yeah. Well, and I also worry a lot about the fact that we are substituting human beings with chatbots and with, you know, chatbot therapists and friends. And our brain needs human connection. We need to breathe the same space. We need to, you know, have that face-to-face connection with other humans. And we live in the most connected time in our history, and people are more lonely than ever.
I agree with you. And I read something a few weeks back, actually, that says when we are on screens like you and I are today, which I suppose is the benefit, right? Because, you know, we are in 2 different continents. But I think, so that's the benefit. But I think one of the challenges is you don't actually truly connect because you're not making that eye contact at the same level. Even though we might be looking at each other, you don't have that level of eye contact, which creates that level of connection. And so much more is online these days.
Right.
And I agree with you. I think we're substituting that relationship connection for online. Like, people are creating friends with, you know, their AI chatbots. I really would love to know what your thoughts are. You mentioned therapy earlier with chatbots. What are your thoughts on that?
I am not a fan because I think that, first of all, a chatbot's only as good as its programmer. And so if you want to have a chatbot that you can have a conversation with that says, hey, you know, give me a routine for self-care. Okay, it can spit one of those out. Or, you know, give me some questions I should answer, whatever. It can do that. But when you start to think about therapy, to me, it's such a personal experience because it's about how I created those associations in my brain and how I have certain biases in my brain that are related to sometimes faulty associations. And so how is a chatbot going to be able to pick up those kinds of things? And the other thing too is when people are depressed and they're not engaging with people, going to your therapist is a chance to sit in a room with another human. And our body releases chemicals when we're engaging with other people that make us feel good. So there's a biochemical thing that goes on when we're in social settings, and we're missing that. I think the other thing that is really scary is that the more we spend online, and so this is a little bit of a shift from bots, but like even thinking of social media, I can get online and have a very low risk, high reward experience. I can just change my profile picture to a flag or a button or a ribbon for a disease or something, and I can get like 4,000 dopamine hits from people hitting like. So it's very low risk, very high reward. But altruism happens in real places, right? So if you and I are together and you fall down, or somebody's being mean to you and I step in, that's high risk, and I get one thank you. And so the risk reward. So we're starting to see this decline of just even altruism among people, which is also troubling.
I think that is such a fascinating point that you raise, Lisa, and I agree with you. I feel like when we're online, we become much more self-obsessed, and we maybe become more worried about what's happening with ourselves and less sort of outward focusing. And in fact, one of the quickest ways to reduce depression and anxiety is actually to do something for someone else. So take the focus off yourself and focus and do something with someone else. So I think it's a really important point that you raise and something to be aware of as we sort of go through life. I want to know if a leader is listening to this conversation, and I think it's been such a well-rounded, really interesting conversation. What are some of the principles, maybe one or two simple things that a leader could apply tomorrow to their teams that would really make a big difference in the way that their teams engage, interact, and perform at work?
Well, I think from anything they can do to create a sense of belonging and common purpose. So social scientists call it a collective identity. So we're very different. And the research actually grew out of the research on diversity training and all of the work that we've done. And they said, we've actually kind of failed because people are not developing strong ties with people who are very different. We still tend to hunker down with like people. And so they started looking at what is it like, let's look at groups where that isn't the case. And they looked at the military and they said, the military, these guys have, and girls have strong ties that last years and years, even though they come from wildly different backgrounds. And they said it's because they have a collective identity. So when they are together, they are soldier first. And then all the other things are just extra about them that make them individuals. So when we have an organization, we need to develop a collective identity. And that's developed through a shared understanding of culture, through routine, through stuff. I mean, through the merch, we wear the same things. We have a handshake. We have routines. We have practices. We have celebrations. We have these things that we do. And so I think a leader really thinking about how am I developing a sense of collective identity within my teams. So that's one thing. The other thing that's much more practical and kind of a to-do is when you are working with teams, define the type of talking that you want to do. So there's 4 kinds of talking. So there is a debrief, which the purpose of a debrief is a directive is to clarify the expectations. The decision has been made. This is a directive, and here's what you have to do. So you debrief people in that directive about here's the expectations. I have been in more meetings where a directive is being delivered, and then the conversation digresses into should we have ever made this decision, or I don't think we should do that. I think we should do this. And now you've spun people into conflict. The second kind of talking is a dialogue, and a dialogue seeks to understand. And so when you're having a dialogue, you're looking at something from every angle, you're brainstorming intended, unintended consequences. And what I see a lot of times is that groups move from, and it's kind of like what you referenced earlier, I'm really busy, so I just rush a decision. They move from, they're supposed to be having a dialogue, and then somebody's a loudmouth in the group and kind of takes over the conversation, and all of a sudden now we're making a decision. And then we have to unravel that decision because we didn't think it through. And so people learn to just disengage and say, I'll just wait until he gets to iteration 3 because it keeps changing. The other type of discussion is a discussion, right? The other type of talking. So a discussion seeks to decide. And so once you've had a dialogue and you say, okay, based on the dialogue and all the different things we've considered and the directives from above, here's our choices. So let's debate them, let's figure it out. And the purpose is by the end of this meeting, we're going to decide. And then the last is a data debrief. And the data debrief is really looking at data and thinking, how do we actually communicate, what we did, what we wanted to happen. I see data debriefs with just reams and reams of numbers and nobody even understands what it is. So really thinking, how do you crunch those numbers to create the case and the story of those numbers? And so if leaders start to define the type of thinking, it reduces conflict. It gives people clarity on what the expectation is for the conversation, and it can move your teams to be more efficient and effective in their decision-making processes.
I think that's really powerful, naming it up front, because I always say, and Brene Brown says this, clear is kind. And so going into a room where people are really clear on what their contribution should be, I think is really important. So that's a great tip. You touched on belonging when you were first speaking about that answer. And I think sometimes belonging and fitting in can be used interchangeably, but they're actually opposing. What are your thoughts on that? Or can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think fitting in is walking into a culture that is already set and you have to adapt yourself to be in there. Belonging is a place where you are part of that culture, where who you are as an individual adds value to the culture. and helps to shape it. So when we think of just fitting in, when you're new, you're going to go in and kind of feel out a culture. But the point is, once you're comfortable, that culture, and, if you're celebrating actions that people are doing, and if I'm doing those actions, then I'm now part of that culture because I'm living that culture. It's not just words, it's what I do and who I am.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's important. And sometimes when you're fitting in, you can feel the least yourself too, which I think, erodes your self-trust over time. What is one myth about performance or behavior that neuroscience has completely changed your mind about?
I think it is, I've learned that we have a lot less control over ourselves unless we're very intentional about building it. So behavior is that intersection of biology and context. So if we don't understand our biology, if we're not keeping our biology calm, if we don't have the self-awareness to be able to tell our brain, because this is the CEO, right? Just like a CEO of a company, I need to create the culture in this part of my brain that I want it to have. And I guess I never understood how much our brain retains things from years and years, even things that we don't consciously remember. We think of our memory as just like a library where you go pull your memory out and read it, but our memories are actually fragmented into multiple different parts of our brain. And it takes the thinking part of our brain to pull all those fragments up and make semantic memory out of it, or a meaningful memory. So I think that was interesting to me because I just always kind of thought, well, it's the story of your life, but it's actually not the story. It's the sensory associations that your brain has made.
And that's, I often say we don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are. And that's exactly that point.
Yes.
It's all of those stories that our brain's bringing together that influence the way that we see the world, which is why I think paradox is so important, and the ability to hold that two things can be true because two people have two different experiences, So I think that's really important. Is there a question that I haven't asked you today, Lisa, that you were hoping that I'd ask you that you want to share with the audience?
I don't think so. I think the main thing that I want the audience to think about is that we get to choose. We can choose to be happy. We can choose to be fulfilled. Choosing it doesn't mean you get it, right? You choose it, but then you have to be intentional and you have to set up routines and practices that are addressing both the unconscious part of your brain and also the conscious part of your brain. And the good news is your brain will learn it and eventually it will do it without you directing it. But becoming happier and healthier and more successful is intentional and takes practice and time.
Yeah, absolutely. What's one practice that is a non-negotiable for you every day, Lisa?
Every day when I wake up in the morning, I stay in bed for a couple minutes and I keep my eyes closed and I visualize the beach because that's like my happy place. And I close my eyes, smell it, I feel it, I can feel everything about it. And my body just calms. It's my place of joy. And I think, people know what they feel like when they're angry and when they're anxious, but a lot of people can't tell you what they feel like when they feel joy or happiness or contentment. So I try to spend some time each day just recognizing that I'm content and then just feeling how my body feels and trying to make that connection. And I find that it keeps me so much calmer and it primes my brain to look for things that I find that are joyful.
Yeah. What a great practice. Do you live near the beach?
No, we live near a river, so I do have water, but
Yes.
but I wish it was the beach because it's just not the same. You don't have the sound and the rhythm, and so I have a sound machine, and I go to Florida every so often.
Great, that's good to hear. I love that you say that. I live by the beach. Many Australians do because we're a coastal country, and that's my non-negotiable. Every day is to get some time down the beach because it does the same for my brain and my body for sure. Where can everyone find you, Lisa? If people want to find more about your work, if they want to find your new book, where can they find you?
Sure. So they can, I'm on LinkedIn, just Lisa Riegel. I have an author page on Amazon that has both Neurowell and the aspirations to operations that we talked about that are both kind of rooted in brain science. And then they can, go to my website, lisariegel.com, or if there are any educators listening, epinstitute.net, like education partnerships. is my website that's more kind of education focused.
Got it. Perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining today. I think you've given so many wonderful tips, but also a real education in the brain in a really practical way so that we can better understand ourselves. It's that metacognition, isn't it? Thinking about the way that we think. And I think that's been a wonderful lesson and a great conversation. So thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for joining me on Work and Wellness. If today's episode resonated with you, remember, someone in your network might need to hear this too. Share it with a colleague or friend who could use these insights. I'd love to keep the conversation going, so find us on Instagram at Mind Your Grit, where we share daily tips and continue these discussions. And if you found value in today's episode, please take time to rate and review the show. It makes such a huge difference and helps other people discover conversations they might really need. Don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. Each week, we're building a community of people who believe that success and well-being go hand in hand. You can find the notes, resources, and links from today's episode at mindyourgrit.com. This is Work and Wellness with Ange Davis. Your work matters, your wellness matters, and this is where it all comes together. See you next week.